There we go. Okay, nobody else is in the waiting room. All right. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining our tonight's program. Of course, now somebody just came in, and let me admit them real quick. Hi, Caitlin. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our tonight's program, our book talk with Maire Mullins. So let me introduce myself quickly. My name is Megan Cahill Senza. I am WWBA's Events and Media Director for the Walt Whitman Birthplace. We are a museum which is located in Huntington, Long Island, New York. We offer tours in person and virtually of the house that Walt Whitman was born in 202 years ago. So again, thank you for all for coming. I am going to put in the chat box a link for all of you if you are interested in donating $5 to our museum to help our programs and everything else to keep going on. And I'm going to direct it over to Cynthia Shore, who is our director.
Okay, well, thank you, Megan. And welcome. Megan is new and she's doing a terrific job. She's been with us about 4 weeks. And I welcome her and all of you tonight. Especially, I welcome Maire Mullins, our presenting her wonderful book about Hannah Whitman Heyde. And I'd like to say hello on behalf of the Board of Trustees. I see some board members in the audience. And on behalf of our association, I see some of our members in the audience. And I feel like I'm doing the romper room. I see my friend Catherine in California. And it's great to have you all here to come to our programs. We work very hard to continue to do this during COVID. And thanks to your wonderful donations, we've been able to keep our doors open and keep the path to Walt's house nice and green. And we welcome you all to come in person or to join our Zooms as you have been doing. It gives me great pleasure to have you here tonight. And many of you in the audience are writers. And I would like to say that as writers, we all know a good story starts with a journey. And Maire is going to tell us her journey. But she took a side trip journey to the Walt Whitman house in 2017, a long time ago, when she was writing her book. And we had authentic letters from Hannah in our vault, and we invited her to come and we took them out and we showed her other artifacts. And it was wonderful to have her then. And she came back in 2019 to the birthplace for our Whitman Festival. And many of you were there to that festival too in 2019, the bicentennial year. So it's wonderful. I was just saying in pre-chat here that we are a Whitman family. We contain multitudes within ourselves and as a group. And I am thrilled to have you join us tonight. I know people are going to be hopping on as it goes on. And it's my pleasure to introduce Maire Mullins. She's a professor of English at Pepperdine University. And I was asking Maire, for her awards and what other honors she would like me to introduce her, and she declined. She just said, please just introduce me as my name and professor. So I shall honor her wishes in that, but we know that she is quite an accomplished as a teacher and a professor, as a Whitman scholar, and now as a Hannah Whitman Heyde scholar. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Maire and tell everyone to sit back and enjoy. We will have Q&A afterwards, and you can either raise your hand or put it into the chat group, and Megan will manage that quite well. So thank you for coming. And now may I present Maire Mullins, our guest speaker of the night, who is having a book talk on Hannah Whitman Heyde, The Complete Correspondence. Welcome, Maire.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you. And thank you, Megan. I really want to extend my gratitude to both of you for your hospitality, and especially Cynthia, who's always been so helpful to me in tracking down letters and materials that I might need from the Walt Whitman birthplace. And it's always such a pleasure to go and to see you, Cynthia, and to see walk the lovely grounds and see where Walt Whitman was born. I highly recommend it. If you haven't been there, it's a treat. I also want to thank my family, some members of whom are here. I see my husband, Paul, is here, and my mother is here, Harriet, for your tremendous support over the years in this project. Paul's been my travel partner to Vermont on a few trips, so that's been fun. And also my colleagues and friends at Pepperdine University, some of whom are here tonight. I appreciate your being here. Thank you for your support. And friends from the community, from Southern California, and Whitmanians from across the country. I want to thank you for your expertise and insight that I've learned from over the years, and some students that are here from Pepperdine as well. I see some students are here. So finally, I'd like to thank my editor at Bucknell, because Suzanne Guiad believed in this project. I had shared this project with about 20 presses, but Suzanne was the one who said, this is something that we want to publish. And that was a magical moment for me, because I felt as if Hannah was channeling me, or she was communicating with me that finally her letters, her correspondence, and her story was going to be told. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you so you can see some of the images of what I found on my journey in getting this book of her letters published, and some of the information about her background that you might find interesting and somewhat shocking. So I'm going to share my screen now and share my PowerPoint with you. So bear with me while I do that. Let's see, desktop, share. And here we go. I'm going to put this in presentation mode so that I can do that. There we go. Okay. So the title of the book, I wanted, and Suzanne agreed with me, I wanted Hannah's name to be front and center first. So her name is there. And then underneath is the indicating her complete correspondence that I could locate. There could be more letters out there in some collections, but this is what we know of right now that exists. So these are her letters, that her complete correspondence that exists in all of the many collections across the country where her letters are. And I'll say more about that in a moment. Here is a daguerreotype of Hannah that I located at the Walt Whitman house on Mickle Street in Camden, New Jersey, which is the last house where Whitman lived when he died. This is in the vault there, and I'm very grateful to Leo Blake for allowing me to have access to this daguerreotype. You might see it as a little bit scratched on the surface, but you might also notice the elaborate frame around the daguerreotype. So Hannah was born in Brooklyn, and she was the second daughter and fourth child of Louisa Van Velser Whitman and Walter Whitman. And she may have been the most beloved of all the Whitman siblings. Prior to her marriage at the age of 28 to the Vermont landscape painter, Charles Louis Heyde, Hannah lived at home. Her letters reveal that she was emotionally close to all of her family members, but perhaps closest of all to her mother, Louisa Van Velser Whitman, and to her older brother, Walt. Soon after her marriage and her move to Vermont, Hannah disclosed in her letters to Mother Whitman that she had become the target of Heidi's escalating verbal, emotional, and physical abuse. While many of her letters are missing or were destroyed, there is enough evidence in the letters that remain to provide deeper insight into Hannah's situation and into the phenomenon of intimate partner violence in 19th century America. Relatively penniless, isolated, and abused for decades, Hannah nevertheless recorded her experiences in the letters that she wrote to her mother, Louisa, and to her brother, Walt. The recovery of her voice is vital to a full understanding of Walt Whitman's work. Reading her letters deepens our contextual understanding of Walt Whitman's relationships with family members, and in these letters, she tells her own story and writes privately about her experiences. Her letter writing served as a refuge, as a temporary relief, and as an escape from the abuse she experienced during the 40 years of her marriage. Hannah received letters not only from Mother Whitman, but also from her brothers, Walt, George, and Jeff, since she refers to their letters in her correspondence. This is the only known image of Hannah, and this daguerreotype was probably taken in the mid to late 1850s. I think it must have been shortly after her father Walter's death in 1855. In this portrait, as you'll notice, Hannah is wearing a black dress with white half sleeves and a black shawl draped across her shoulders. Her hair, in ringlets, is pulled back from her forehead. Hannah's hands are crossed in front of her, and it looks as if her fingers are entwined. On her wrists, she wears what appears to be black cloth bands. In a letter to her brother Walt, Hannah wrote, "I don't make a good picture," yet her gaze in this portrait shows serenity and self-possession. Hannah resembled both her mother, pictured here, and her brother Walt. "Mother, as I grow older," she writes, "I can see I look more like you. Often when I am fixing my hair, I think how much I begin to look like you." Her gray eyes, the shape of her face, and the color of her hair were also similar to those of her older brother Walt. Many of the letters that were addressed to Hannah have been lost or destroyed, some by Hannah herself. Heide's violent behavior after reading letters from the Whitman family motivated Hannah to dispose of or to hide letters that she had received from her mother and her brothers, unfortunately, especially her brother Walt. In spring 1856, she writes, "I had just received and was reading your letter today as Charlie came in to dinner. Charlie has not felt good-natured today. When he read your letter," this is to her mother, "he appeared quite angry. He talks so singular when he is angry. I feel so much afraid." Several times Hannah asked her mother to destroy the letters that Hannah had written to her. She writes, "I know this is very silly, but I should depend certainly upon no one seeing it but you, and upon your destroying this letter at once. I could say much, but I think it is very bad for me to tell or to speak to you of disagreeable things." Nevertheless, Hannah's extant letters survived, primarily because Mother Whitman and Walt saved the letters that Hannah had sent to them and to her brothers, her other brothers. The abiding affection that Walt and Hannah felt for each other is evident. In many of her letters, Hannah expresses concern for Walt's health, and the evidence of remaining correspondence suggests that Walt Whitman continued to write to his sister once or twice a week after their mother's death in 1873, until Walt's death in 1892. The last letter that he wrote, dated March 17, 1892, pictured here, was addressed to Hannah. Unable to write much, Whitman notes, "Your good letter received, $4 enclosed. God bless you, WW." Hannah wrote to her mother, "I never in my life see anybody so good and have so much patience with me as Walt does. I don't know what makes him so good. It's the kindness I care for." Hannah knew that she could count on Whitman for emotional support. He never failed her. Walt Whitman was never wealthy, as we know, but he enriched Hannah's life with his steady concern for her well-being. Reading Hannah's correspondence provides readers with deeper insight into domestic violence in the United States during the mid-19th century. Understanding contemporary responses to domestic violence in this time period allows readers to contextualize Hannah's individual situation and to weigh this information against the portrayal of Hannah in biographies of Walt Whitman. For the most part, the characterization of Hannah that exists in these biographies has been negative, blaming Hannah for the abuse that she suffered, and at times castigating her for her supposed lack of domestic skills. Whitman's biographers have misconstrued the seriousness and the complexity of Hannah's situation. And Justin Kaplan, in his biography, dismisses Hannah as, quote, psychotic, David Reynolds reports, the neurotic Hannah dressed carelessly, never learned to cook, and kept a messy house. Jerome Loving concludes that Hannah was a hypochondriac caught up in a bad marriage. Reading Hannah's correspondence after her father's death, Gay Wilson Allen notes that Hannah, quote, secretly enjoyed her misery. Subsequent letters, he writes, were to reveal an unmistakable masochistic tendency, end quote. As counter testimony to these portrayals, Hannah's correspondence reveals a chilling, ongoing pattern of abuse, beginning in the years shortly after her marriage. I feel I don't deserve the treatment I get, Hannah writes in one of her letters to Walt. In this collection of letters, for the first time, readers are provided with an alternative perspective, Hannah's. She describes her living conditions, what happens to her, and how she responds to Heide's violent behavior. The evidence in the correspondence records the repeated abuse, now known as battering, that she suffered. The Whitman family devised plans many times to remove Hannah, but for numerous reasons, their plans did not come to fruition. Hannah's fragile health, the inability of family members to travel to Vermont, and lack of certainty about where Hannah would live and how she would support herself may have all been factors. In addition, there was little or no public discourse or understanding of violence against women. Ultimately, her family was unable to intervene. Her decision to remain with Heide after the abuse began was complicated. In the case of Hannah and Heide, the victim and the perpetrator were entangled through the bonds of marriage, which were not easy to dissolve in the 19th century. As such, they shared a bond that the justice system deemed virtually undissolvable. Hannah's experience of violence was complicated by proximity. Heide was her cohabiting partner, although he often did not share living space with her, as Hannah reports. It was complicated by custom. The communities that they lived in perceived Heide and Hannah as a married couple. And it was complicated by their shared lives and experiences. Heide and Hannah had a developing history, and over time it became more difficult for Hannah to extricate herself. Moreover, as often occurs, Hannah bore the brunt of the blame for the violence rather than Heide. After one abusive episode, Hannah reports, it made some talk, of course, about the hotel. I have to bear the blame. Even today, victims of violence are blamed as if they were the cause of the violence or as if they were asking for the violence. Hannah could not easily leave Heide. She had no economic resources, and he would not give her access even to small funds. As experts note, there are countless reasons why a woman stays with a violent partner. Women and their abusive partners have an interwoven, complex life together that is not easy to walk away from financially or emotionally. Hannah did think of leaving Heide, but her financial situation gave her pause. I don't know how or what I should do to support myself without him, Hannah writes in 1856. Various poems and passages in Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass may have been influenced by Whitman's awareness of Hannah's situation and his concern for her. Specifically, section 11 of Song of Myself, where he describes a lonesome, isolated woman who lives in a house by a shore. The second edition of Leaves of Grass, published in 1856, is especially revelatory. If you read this edition after you read her correspondence, you'll see many resonances. I'm thinking especially of the second poem, Poem of Women, later titled Unfolded Out of the Folds in that edition. This seems to be a direct rebuke to Heide's constant undercutting of Hannah's abilities. In Poem of the Body from the same edition, later titled I Sing the Body Electric, Whitman added an extended catalog to complement his earlier assertion that the woman's body is sacred, perhaps in answer to the physical assaults that Hannah reported. In many of the Children of Adam poems from the 1860 edition, Whitman repeatedly affirms the equality of men and women. Because Mother Whitman lived in New York while Walt lived in Washington, D.C. from 1863 to 1874, Mother Whitman may be credited with collecting and saving the letters that were addressed to her from Hannah. But it is also possible that some of the letters Hannah wrote to Mother Whitman were read by her and then tucked into a letter and sent to Walt. This was a very common practice in the Whitman family. They would exchange correspondence from each other by tucking letters from each other to each other. So her letters to both Mother Whitman, Hannah's letters to both Mother Whitman and to Walt are mixed in with each other in the largest collection of her letters, which is at the Library of Congress, to which I'm very grateful. I've made several visits there to look at this the largest collection of her letters. And this suggests that Walt was probably the last Whitman family member to own the collection of Hannah's letters. An examination of her handwriting indicates that she had received educational instruction in cursive.
Mhm.
The way she forms capital letters in particular suggests that she must have had formal schooling. Many of her letters were written surreptitiously because Heyde was surveilling her correspondence to her family. In some instances, Hannah had to write her letters quickly and bring them to the post office without Heidi's knowledge. In addition to controlling her behavior through surveillance of the letters she wrote to her family, Heyde also read the letters that she received from her family. He was not able to intercept all of the correspondence, however. Some of the letters from her family arrived intact with the gifts or the small funds that either Walt or her mother, well, mostly Walt, had tucked into the letters. And some of her letters were written and sent without Heidi's perusal. It was the threat of his oversight, however, that compelled Hannah to write secretly and at times hurriedly. Before posting them, she reread her letters. She didn't recopy them, but she reread them. And she often added words or sentences in between the lines of what she had already written, or at the end of the letter. Sometimes she would write upside down at the top of the page, or even in the margins if there was room. Some of the smudges, and this is very interesting because one of my students at Pepperdine noticed this, and I'm very grateful to her because I think it's very suggestive and very interesting. Some of the smudges in the letters even look like teardrops. And that one image there in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen suggests that probably she was crying at times when she wrote the letters. And I think I'm thinking specifically Whitman wrote a poem called Teardrops that may have been inspired by some of her letters. The letters that I've been able to locate have been placed in this collection in chronological sequence, which wasn't always easy because Hannah didn't always date her letters. She would write her location, but not necessarily the date on the letter. So I had to piece it together based on where she was and when she was in that place, also looking at some of Heidi's paintings, which did have dates on them. So I knew where they were living at the time. But we do know that she arrived with her husband in Vermont in 1852. So that is where the collection begins. And the collection ends with her last letter displayed here, written in 1905 at the Walt Whitman Birthplace Association House in the Vault, and addressed to Mrs. Romana Samus of the Huntington, Long Island Historical Society. And I'm very grateful to Margaret Guardy for helping me to locate that information. And this letter is important because Hannah confirms Whitman's birthplace. In this letter, she was the last surviving sibling of the siblings of the Whitman family, and was able to identify that indeed her brother had been born here. Until they purchased a house in Burlington, Vermont, however, early on in her marriage, the Heides lived in a series of boarding houses and hotels throughout Vermont, depending on where Heyde had received a painting commission. So this transient lifestyle also impeded her ability to make close friendships. There's no indication in her letters that she was able to achieve the emotional connectedness of deep friendship that she did have with her family. She survived because she developed tactics to avoid debilitation. Her connection to her family provided her with strength. Because she didn't have close support networks and there was no contemporary societal understanding of her situation, she had to cultivate strategies for survival. Her letters were the one place where she could freely write without the ongoing trauma in her life. And she could freely write about the ongoing trauma, and where she could expect unconditional love and attentive care in return. For the first time, readers have access to the same information that the Whitman family had access to, and her story can at last be told from her perspective. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now and turn it back over to Megan. I think Megan will oversee any questions or comments that you may have.
Yeah, so if you don't feel like speaking because you're camera shy, I understand. You can put your questions in the chat box. If you'd like to speak up, if you see on your bottom of your screen where you find the chat box, there's react, and there should be a raise hand button like that. So I will be able to see that way too. So. Paul has the first question. Go ahead, Paul.
I probably should know this since I've been, living with this project and a long time, but that house is kind of nice in Burlington. So did he get successful as a painter finally? And when they were living in boarding houses, was it because he was like a ne'er-do-well? Was he alcoholic or something? Was that part of what was going on with him? And then who died first in the couple? How did that play out?
Oh, those are good questions. They were living in boarding houses and hotels because he wanted to travel to, he was a landscape painter, and he wanted to be on site when he did his sketches, and then he would go back and paint. He didn't really have a permanent studio until after they bought their house in Burlington, Vermont in 1864. So he really believed that he needed to be able to travel to visit the waterfalls, to visit the vistas and the places where he painted from. And that's why they had a transient lifestyle. He supported himself through a series of lotteries that he would give at hotels where they would stay. He would basically sell tickets and then to the people who would come through the boarding house or the hotel, and then he would raffle off one of his paintings. But of course, in the latter part of the 19th century, with the rise of photography, there wasn't much demand for his paintings after the 1860s and 1870s. So even though he did have enough money to buy a house in 1864 in Burlington, and it was a nice house, you're right, it's been razed, it's not there anymore. But from pictures, we can see it was a nice house. He was able to purchase that house, but he did have a hard time maintaining it and getting the money to maintain it. And so he would often write to Walt Whitman and beg him for money. Or he would simply take the money that Whitman had sent to Hannah out of the envelopes. He would confiscate the money. He probably had a drinking problem that may have been one of the reasons why he was so abusive, but he began to drink very heavily, probably even in the late 1850s and 1860s. We know this because there are reports of his dishevelment in the 1880s and early 1890s. He died in 1892, same year as Walt Whitman. So Hannah had about a decade and a half where she basically stayed in the house in Burlington. She didn't relocate. She was supported through her brother, George, who was a pipe fitter and actually did amass a small fortune, which he ultimately left to her. So she had a kind of trust fund that she lived off of after Heidi passed away. So I hope that answers your question, Paul. Any other questions?
I have a question in the chat, and then I'll go to Gwen right after. Catherine writes, how did they meet? Did they have children?
Well, unfortunately, I think Walt Whitman introduced Heidi to his sister because Whitman was involved in art societies in the 1840s and 1850s. And I think this is to his regret, to Walt Whitman's regret. He and Heidi had a connection. Heidi had published a collection of poetry, and Heidi considered himself to be an artist of the word, the spoken, the written word, as well as of painting. And so it's likely that he introduced Heidi to Hannah. They did not have children. And I write about this in my introduction to the correspondence. I believe that Hannah must have suffered from endometriosis based on a lot of how she describes her suffering, the way she describes her suffering. I just don't think they were able, they may have been, I just don't know why they didn't have children, aside from the fact that she did suffer terribly from that disease. She called it a falling of the womb. I think she refers to it in one of her letters in that way. But for a childless couple in the late 19th century, there are all kinds of, sort of emotional challenges to navigate, because this is a society where married couples are expected to have children. So there's also that added layer to their relationship, is the fact that they didn't have children. So that's a very good question.
When I know your hand was raised. Are you good?
Yes.
I just Maire, I just wanted to thank you for this whole presentation. You're making visible what was so invisible. And I happen to know that these women were pathologized, and that when Freud did, I was just looking up the date, Sigmund Freud did studies in hysteria in 1895. These women were pathologized the whole entire way through. And in fact, women with abuse histories, intimate partner abuse, sexual abuse, have all been pathologized, told they're hysterical, things along those lines, until very, very recently, unfortunately, perhaps over the last 2 decades or so, when there's been more of a movement, which in a certain kind of way, I credit to Ellen Bass, who's a wonderful poet, and she was doing the Courage to Heal. She came up with the Courage to Heal workbook, and she learned back in about early 1990, thereabouts, 1988, women were telling their stories through writing workshops. And she started in the field of psychoanalysis. I mean, the field of psychoanalysis was absolutely deficient, very, very, very sexist against women. And so, the whole movement of women being believed didn't really begin until about into the 1990s and everything. I mean, I know because I worked in this movement. I know because I started a group for women with histories of childhood sexual trauma in 1990. So I know what they went through. And I've done lots of studying, teaching, etc. on the subject. But what do I want to say? I guess what I want to say is that I'm very glad that you brought this to light. And Hannah was not alone. She was certainly not alone. And she would feel very isolated, very stigmatized, very ashamed. She was trying to reach out and be courageous, but she was not alone. If only she knew how many women were in her shoes one way or the other, it probably would have changed the course of her sense about herself and her life. So I just want to thank you for bringing this, to light, especially in relation to Walt Whitman and his sister, because I never would have known this. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gwen. You know, it's interesting because in the course of my research, I realized that what Heidi had done was to start a letter writing campaign of his own. So he would attempt to overwrite her so that whatever she wrote to her family, he also wrote to her family. And of course, they never believed him. And it's interesting to me that of all the people, of all the letters that I've written by Walt Whitman, the only person that I could say that Walt Whitman ever hated was Charles Heyde. He called him a snake. I've never seen that in any of Whitman's work. This is the only time I've seen Whitman get angry. And Horace Traubel would take note of it. And in fact, they cut some of Whitman's letters out of the correspondence where there were angry parts of his letters. I write about this in my correspondence. So yes, Walt Whitman felt very strongly about what was going on. So thank you, Gwen. I feel like this has been a mission to get Hannah's voice out there and for people to understand what happened to her. And like you said, what was probably happening to a lot of other women at the time. So.
And then just one other point before I let other people who want to respond is that I'm also struck by, this is very edifying because I'm also struck therefore by the fact that she had a good brother. She had a brother who was a witness and was trying to intercede to the extent that he could and put himself out there. And, that's pretty special. So I'm glad to hear about that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful relationship. It's a beautiful relationship to follow, to read about in the correspondence. And I'm also editing some of his letters to her that are going to be put on the Walt Whitman archive probably next summer. So that whole collection of letters from a brother to a sister, from a sister to a brother is going to go up on the archive. So you'll be able to see. My last slide, I had one of his letters up there to her. So a lot of his letters to her are also going to be coming forward to talk more about this relationship.
Amazing, wonderful. I look forward. Thank you.
Interesting.
Thank
you.
Just to follow up on Gwen's comment, Martha Deed wrote in the chat, I couldn't agree more, Gwen. I worked on Mary Brewster's diary, 1867 to 1872. And she alluded to violence against women among women she met, especially in the mining towns of the West. And also how difficult to know the true person you are marrying, especially in a place, mining town, where virtually everyone was a recent inhabitant. So I just wanted to read that. And then I'm going to just say the order. I'm going to have Lisa go next. And then after Lisa, I'm going to go back into the chat, and then Katie's going to go. And then Catherine.
Okay, I guess it's me.
Yep.
Thanks, Mary. That was really incredible. I mean, exactly what Gwen said, recovering her voice, but interesting, recovering a voice of someone who had already been pushed out into the public world, looking a certain way because of her brother. So it's not like she even could keep her private pain private. She was kind of thrust out there and misunderstood and represented in a certain way. So it's really incredible that you recovered all of that.
Thank you.
I just want to throw one question out. It's interesting, just yesterday in a class I was teaching, we looked at Elizabeth Ashbridge's narrative from 100 years earlier. She writes it in 1755. And she is also a victim of intimate partner violence. When she becomes a Quaker, her husband, won't let her go to meetings. He hits her, he threatens her with a knife, that kind of thing. And it's in the narrative. And in class, we talk about how she kind of recasts this a bit for herself through her spirituality. She feels that God is still watching out for her, still hears her prayers, and actually strengthens her through it. And so we talk in class a little bit about how she reworks that for herself to kind of help her overcome and to find strength through it. I know you don't have the same kind of writing with Hannah, but I was wondering, I liked your comments about how her letters were her way of creating, or not creating, but kind of conceptualizing what she was going through and the support of her family and the ability to tell her story. I was wondering, are these ways, or maybe other ways, that you found her kind of recasting what she was going through and just trying to process it in a way that she could overcome it and sort of take strength from it?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It helped her to understand her experience in a different way because she could write about her experiences. Most of her letters, many of her letters addressed to her mother, where she would be describing the abuse. It allowed her to process it in a different way and to maybe distance herself from it, from the immediacy of it, and the shockingness of it, given the public face that Heyde turned to the world. And I've been to Vermont, to those museums where his paintings hang, and I've seen how he's regarded in Vermont. And it's just astonishing to me that all of this was going on at the same time, that he could have a public face and that he could write letters to the Whitman family suggesting that she was a horrible housekeeper. She wouldn't, do the laundry. I mean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then even castigating Louisa for not raising a daughter who knew how to take care of a household. So there's the public face of him, and he's getting, attention. And then she's kind of trapped in this situation. But to come back to the notion of spirituality, often abused women would go to their church communities, as you may know, for assistance. But Hannah didn't belong to any church communities that I know of, so she wouldn't have been able to avail herself of that kind of support. So, and a Quaker woman, that is surprising. Given that, the nature of the Quaker approach to humanity, that she would have been suffering such abuse at the hands. A Quaker woman would have been suffering this kind of abuse. But I'm going to have to look at her work. Thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Thanks, Mary.
Okay, so I'm gonna go into the chat, I think. Oh, somebody just came in. Hold on. So Margaret Guardi writes, is there any information about where Heyde received his education? Also, do you think Hannah and her family's support when she was married? I'm sorry, hold on, I didn't read that right. So let me start over. Is there any information about where Heyde received his education? Also, do you think Hannah had her family support when she married Heyde, particularly her father, Walter Sr.?
It's hard to know if she had her family support. I think she probably did, because he was, I think, a friend of Walt Whitman's, and likely Whitman introduced them. So she probably initially had her family support. And he writes a very pleasant letter to Mother Whitman when they arrived in Vermont after they had first gotten married. So at that point, the family relations were positive. As far as where he received his education, I'm not sure. I don't know. He claimed all kinds of background regarding his own father. Heyde did, but I've looked at records, and there's some discrepancies in what he said about where he was from and what profession his father followed. So it's hard to know. I think he may have been from Philadelphia, and I think his mother was a hatter, Hatter. But I am not sure where he received his education, but he was an educated person. He was literate, he wrote poetry, and his paintings did get some acclaim, although not as much as he would have wanted in his time. So I don't have any information about that, Margaret. It's a good question.
Okay. Up next is Katie. You say Fry or Frey?
Fry.
Hi,
Okay.
Katie.
Thank you. Hi, Mary. That was a fascinating talk, very insightful, and thinking about Whitman's family, and this sort of counter narrative to how Hannah has been publicly presented. I'm wondering if you have thought about ways to bring this into the classroom, to bring your scholarship into the classroom, or if perhaps it has shaped your or impacted how you teach Whitman. I'm wondering what kind of connections you're making the deeper into this project that you get.
That's a great question, Katie. Thank you. I would love to teach this sometime, perhaps in a class on gender and trauma. And I could include some of Walt Whitman's writings as well from the Civil War, but also some of the writings that he did in the Calamus cluster, where because he was gay, he had to be very careful about how he presented himself. So yeah, I think it would be a very interesting class where I could do gender and trauma. I have thought about it, Katie. Thank you again for that reminder. But I've also thought about the ways that I could, and I'd love for Whitman scholars to pick some of these ideas up, because I do think that looking at Whitman through a different lens gives us a different understanding of his work. And looking at Whitman through the lens of how he understood what was going on with his sister, I think provides us with a different understanding of his poetry and his work. So yeah, those are great questions. And yeah, I do need to, I really should bring this into the classroom. So thank you, Katie, for
Thanks,
that
Mary.
question.
Yeah.
Mary, I apologize for coming late.
Oh, not at all, Teresa.
Yeah, I have junior writing portfolios due tonight, so I was fielding questions on Zoom, and then
No,
I'm like,
glad you're here.
I was like, this is
Absolutely glad you're
4:30, right? And then I looked, I'm like, oh,
No, it's okay. Glad you're here, Teresa.
I
Good
always
to
love
see
listening
you.
to you speak. Yeah,
Always good to see you.
and I love Walt Whitman too, so
Glad to hear
Yeah.
that.
big fan. Okay.
So Catherine is next, who has a question.
Hi, everyone. Mary, I'm so happy to see you. We met at the birthplace. It's very exciting. I just love this project. I think it really changes the way I think about Whitman. People talk about his mother so often, but I'm really curious about how equally important maybe his sister would have been to developing his relationships with women and his poetry about women. And I think one of the most important things you're doing that I hear that is so compassionate of you too, is that you're highlighting this abuse that poor Hannah suffered her whole life, but then also the way it's repeated by critics in the 20th century and the 21st century who write about her in these incredibly non-compassionate ways, like person after person after person. It's really striking. Anyway, I wanted to thank you for that. And then I wanted to ask you a speculative question. I'm just curious what you think. So Whitman wasn't perfect in his approach toward women, but he was awfully good, especially for his time. And I'm wondering, when you went through these letters, other than his obvious love for Hannah, what you might have found here that helps us to understand where this understanding of women came from. And you mentioned his being gay. We know how close he was with his female relatives. And I guess I'll end with, like, to what extent do you think it is Hannah herself, this particular relationship, that shapes the way that he poetically describes women and gives them opportunities in his poems that maybe other poets of the era did not?
That was an excellent question, Catherine.
Oh, thanks.
Because I know you've taught Whitman. And, over the years, as I've taught Whitman, I've always wondered why it was that Whitman's work especially resonates with my female students. I have women students who just fall in love with Walt Whitman. And I just always wondered about that. And you're right. I mean, a lot of critics write about his special relationship with his mother, Louisa. But there's no question that it's his relationship with Hannah also inflected his work to a degree that we can't even begin to imagine right now. I think there's so much work that needs to be done here, reading Whitman through the lens of Hannah's correspondence, but also, and I have to say this, his other sister, Mary Elizabeth, as you know, he would visit her in Long Island. He loved her. She was also probably married to a somewhat abusive alcoholic. And so there's a lot of work to be done there to recover her letters. And then there's his relationship to his nieces. Their letters need to be recovered and published. I've read through some of them, they're fascinating. He loved his nieces, Hattie and Jessie. And in fact, his youngest niece went to visit Hannah in the 1880s. She couldn't wait to get out of there. She didn't care for it, but she did visit Hannah in Vermont. So I just think there's a tremendous amount of recovery work to do here, to think about his family relationships, especially with his female relations, so much has been made of his relationships with his brothers. And in my personal opinion, I think Hannah was probably, dare I say it, Hannah was probably his favorite sibling. Now, I know there's going to be some pushback. Everyone says it's Jeff, it's Jeff, it's Jeff. I say, I think it's Hannah. He loved her. He always thought about her. She was constantly on his mind. I can't tell you how many references I've come across in his letters. And there are hundreds and hundreds, as we all know, thousands probably, of letters where he's always asking his mother, how is Hannah? How is Hannah? Have you heard from Hannah? What's going on with Hannah? Hannah was always on his mind. So it's just a fascinating relationship. And to think about the ways, particularly in the second edition of Leaves of Grass, the 1856 edition, where he is talking back to Heyde specifically. Because if you read Charles Heyde's letters, and some of them are on the Walt Whitman archive, Heyde says denigrating things about women. And this has to be read in the context of how he's treating his wife and what he says to her. And I think Whitman is talking back to Heyde as well in some of those poems. And even some of the poems, I think he's characterizing Heyde. And I've written about this in my introduction and in other places, where I think some of his work is also impacted by Heyde and talking and portraying Heyde actually in some of the poems. And it's, if you look at it through the veil of this particular relationship between Heyde and Hannah, you can see that. So I think it opens up some doors for other scholars to look at Whitman's work too. Thank you for that question, Catherine.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating answer. And now I want to go reread that edition thinking of Heyde as an antagonist in it. I think that's such a great way to go back and read it. Thank you so much.
Let's see. Caitlin Shea writes, so thankful that Mary did this research and shed a light on Hannah as a survivor of abuse rather than having her be labeled as neurotic, etc., by scholars going forward. So she asked a very, I think, important question here for everyone else to know, and I'm glad Caitlin wrote in the chat box about this so I can make this announcement. So she did ask, can we come in person to the birthplace to purchase Mary's book, or do you need to order online? So if you haven't purchased the book already and you would like to, and you are local, you can come to the museum and buy the book. And if you buy it within this week, we have a 20% discount going. So, but if you're not local, you can order the book online on our website. So in the chat, you'll see that the link is there as well. Mary, I kind of have a question that followed what Catherine said. did you notice or see in Walt's at poems any like references to Hannah at all and their relationship?
Well, I think perhaps the most direct reference and the most famous passage is section 11 of Song of Myself. And I wrote about this in my introduction. I mentioned it in my PowerPoint. And it was actually Vivian Pollock who saw this. It's okay. It's actually Vivian Pollock who saw this, because it's interesting. Both George Washington Whitman and Hannah Whitman were born on November 28th. This is her brother, George. George and Hannah were both born on November 28th. And as you know, section 11 of Song of Myself begins 28 young men, 28 years, and all so lonely. And Hannah was 28 when she got married. I do think that passage is very much influenced by his understanding of his sister's loneliness, as she is at times living on the shores of in Burlington, on the shores of Lake Champlain. And she is, she writes in some of her letters about the lake itself. He went to visit her in 1872, June 1872, and he walked around Burlington. He saw the beautiful sights. So I do think that's one passage that's probably directly influenced by his relationship with her. There are many others that I haven't even begun to uncover. But if you read the letters, then you look at his poetry, I think you'll come across quite a few. So it's all there and it's all out there, I think, for being uncovered. But that's what immediately comes to mind, Megan. Question.
Thanks. And then I'm not sure if this is the same Catherine or not that just was talking to us, but this Catherine in the chat box wrote, did she have friends or participate in community life in Vermont, or is there any evidence that Heyde kept her isolated?
I don't think she had close friends, but she does write in some of her letters later, her later letters, about playing whist, WHIST, with some women who were in the boarding house where she was. So she enjoyed doing that for a while. I don't think she had any confidants other than the letters that she wrote, other than her mother really was her main confidant. I don't think she had any close friends, unfortunately. So she was very isolated. That's my opinion based on reading her letters. So I could be wrong. Maybe something else would be uncovered that would suggest that she did have close friends, but I don't see any evidence of it from the letters. A very lonely life. And in fact, she repeats the word lonely in a lot of her letters. I'm lonely, she says. Because what he would do often, he had a studio where he would go to paint all day, or sometimes he would take day trips. Once they moved to Burlington and started living there, he would take day trips. So he would be gone all day and she would just be home by herself.
Me.
I don't have any more questions, but Margaret wrote a comment saying, the letters in the book are so moving. Thank you, Mary, for exposing them for our understanding on many levels. So I wanted to read that to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. You really helped me too by helping me to get information about that last letter that identified the Walt Whitman birthplace. So.
Cynthia has a question.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. Thank you, Mary. That was fabulous. And I do want to give that shout out to Margaret Yardy, our historian, who helped Mary and find other interesting facts for Mary and about Hannah. You just touched on this briefly, but I don't know if I missed it. How many letters then did you actually read that Hannah wrote? And other than being described as neurotic or withdrawn, or what was her personality? Did she have any enjoyments? You just mentioned she played whist. Did she enjoy drawing? I mean, what did she do to pass her time? If she didn't have children and she wasn't employed, what did she do with her days? Or was she really withdrawn? I'm trying to get to the personality beneath the abuse.
Well, that's a great question. And one of the things that she loved to do was she loved to sew. That was, and she writes about this in many of her letters. She actually made Charlie, that's what she called him, Heidi. She made him shirts and she would wash them. She took care of all the laundry, and that was very time consuming at the time. She would take care of the rooms where they were staying. And then at one point, he actually bought her a sewing machine, and she loved that. And I have to say that I do see a lot of influence in the social construction of gender. The daguerreotype I showed you, she was very fashion conscious. She would write about what she would wear, if she was keeping up with what other people were wearing in the boarding houses. And I do think that both her and Walt, there are so many portraits of Walt. You can look on the Walt Whitman archive. There are, about 100, Catherine, at least, of Walt Whitman. I think they were both very interested in the way they presented themselves physically, how they constructed dress. So she does like to talk to her mother in some of her letters about what she's wearing, what people in the boarding house are wearing. And she would ask her mom to send her hair. I guess there was a cultural practice where you would buy hair at this time. The ringlets that she's wearing in the daguerreotype, I think she bought those. She asked her mother to buy her hair and send it to her from a place called Bordettes. So she did spend a lot of time thinking about clothing and about what people were wearing. However, because she came from a large working class family, hardscrabble existence, I don't think she had a lot of social skills when she went up with him into these boarding houses. So she dreaded meal times. She didn't like them. She didn't like going and having to eat in public with other people. She writes about this. She was shy, I think, and somewhat withdrawn. But the way she would spend her days often was likely thinking about sewing projects. And that is time consuming. But she was talented. You could see by the way she presented herself in that daguerreotype that she took care about how she would show herself. But if he was hitting her and beating her, and at one point she describes how he tried to choke her, she may not have been able to present herself in the way that she would have wanted to. And he may have been suggesting that she was the one who was initiating the abuse, that she was the one who was causing him to become entangled in these arguments. And because he was very, very articulate and adept socially, he could overtalk her. And eventually she may not even have wanted to go down to these public gatherings because she would be the one who was being blamed for the arguments, for the loudness, for if he's throwing things, she's the one that he would tell people was doing those things. So you see that how this escalated for her and further isolated her from the community. If they're all thinking, oh, well, she's the one who's doing all of this.
Well, that's good to hear that she kept some kernel of herself alive with sewing. And it's a wonderful thing to do. I took sewing as a teenager, and it is quite creative. And you're right, when you look at her picture, she doesn't look abused. I mean, she really looks like she's really very well put together and pleasant and happy. So I am glad that there was something there for her.
Yeah, she was. And her letters, of course.
And how many were there then?
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have answered that question. There were actually, what I could locate, there are 63 in this edition.
Okay.
And I have to say, Bucknell did a great job. I think it's a beautifully produced book, and they were very meticulously careful in the way that they transcribed into print her letters, because I had been very careful, even with the spacing between words, that I wanted to preserve the letters in the way that she wrote them.
Mhm.
Exactly. And so they were extremely careful in the way that they produced the book so that it would match the work that I had done to mirror the letters. So I'm very grateful to them just in looking at the way the book was produced. And I think the beauty of the cover, where you have her daguerreotype there on the cover, I was just thrilled when I saw this, because for me, it was like a breakthrough, like, okay, finally, here she is. Here she is. Here's Hannah. People can see her now, the way Walt saw her, the way her mother saw her, the way her family saw her, not the way Charles saw her.
Mhm.
So, but 63 letters.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Another question. Love on?
Thank you. I won't ask the question that I asked a long time ago in chat.
Oh, well, no, I thought I maybe forgot. And I'm like, oh no, but okay, go. I'm glad. Go ahead.
No, I won't ask that question. I have another question. So was it unusual for a woman to, when she's 28 years old when she gets married? Can you talk a little bit about what we might be able to surmise about that? Was that, quite old? And how might that have affected the dynamics of her family supporting her getting married? Also, was there any evidence of her, if it were some reproductive organ or system issues, they would have been evident perhaps by that time?
Well, as far as marital ages go, I'm not sure exactly, but I do think 28 would have been late. Probably in that time, people were getting married, women were getting married in their early 20s, I believe. I could be wrong. I would have to do some research to confirm that. But I would think that 28 would be late. And what this suggests is that because she lived at home until she was 28, and she had many younger siblings, I think she had 4 or 5 younger siblings, plus Walt, who still lived at home, she was probably helping out a lot with the household. And she developed a very close relationship with her mother because of that. So that's a very good question. The lateness of her marriage date and her age allowed her to develop closer relationships with her siblings while she was at home. And especially with her mother at this time. So I think that's important to bear in mind as to the question of why was she so close to her mother, aside from the fact that, many women are close to their mothers, but especially close at this time because of the later marital age. Did I answer both of your questions? Did I answer your questions?
Yeah. No, I mean, I didn't mean to, what's the word? Infer? Is that the word? Imply that perhaps the family was eager for her to make a marriage at 28 years old. Okay. I'm just saying.
I don't know about that. I think Mother Whitman loved having her children around. The youngest of her children, Eddie, was disabled, and she took care of him. Mother Whitman took care of him. She always wanted her children around. As you can see, if you look at her correspondence, most of which has been placed on the Walt Whitman archive, edited by Wesley Robbie. You can look at her correspondence, but she kept in touch with her children. She wanted George to come back from the Civil War and live with her. She didn't want to go live with him. She wanted everyone to come live with her. She had Jeff living with his family in the same house with her and his 2 daughters and his wife. She became close to everyone that her children were close to. She was the hub. She was the center of the family in many ways. And Walt Whitman was very close to her. So there are those emotional ties as well. I don't get any impression that they wanted Hannah to leave it all. In fact, I think they were somewhat shocked when Mary Elizabeth married so early. She married, I think, before she was even 20. And she went off with Ansel up to the far reaches of Long Island. He worked in a shipyard. And she had, I think, 5 children with him. So her married name is Van Nostrand. And I think there's still Van Nostrands now. But a lot of her letters should be uncovered and published as well.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Good questions. Thank you all for the opportunity to share my research and to share Hannah. I don't think I just feel like somewhat a channeler in some ways, because I really felt like this was a mission to help her to be understood in a different way. That she wasn't treated fairly, as she writes in her letters. She wasn't being treated fairly by Charles. And then, as Catherine pointed out, she wasn't treated fairly by the biographers. But that was because they were reading Charles Heyde's letters and believing him. So.
Mhm.
So thank you to all of you for coming, and I loved your questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I will say thank you for this wonderful, wonderful presentation. It was great seeing you again, even on Zoom. So perhaps your journey will take you back to us in the next year or two.
I'd love to.
Wonderful. And have continued panel discussions. You were mentioning one before that you were on. And so we would love to continue to hear more about your research and Whitman and the Whitman family. It's so interesting to think about the family dynamics between them. And even I had questions about the sisterly dynamics. Did she feel about being an aunt? Did she have any motherly instincts? But, that's another conversation. So please, please look to Mary Elizabeth, and let's continue this. It was great, Mary. It was fabulous. Thank you to all of you who are here. I want to give a shout out to the humanities who support our programs at the birthplace, and to New York State Parks who supports us, and even the Joel Foundation, which is supporting us this year. So please come visit, buy our books. And again, if you buy it this week, you get a 20% discount. If you come and visit us, to join as a member, you get a discount in our gift shop at any rate. So good to see you. Be well, be safe, and let's have a round of applause. We'll take off the mute. Caitlin, Megan, take off the.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Cynthia.
Okay.
Take care.
Okay, thank you.